In suburban Maplewood, a 67-year-old widow was about to face her son's desperate ultimatum. What started as peaceful morning gardening took a shocking turn when she received a hysterical phone call. Cecilia Brown wasn't your typical retired teacher. For decades, she had spent her life rescuing her troubled son from countless crises, known for her unwavering maternal devotion. When David screamed his demand for her house deed, she had no idea she was walking into dangerous territory. Cecilia's instinct to save him would lead to an impossible choice between enabling and tough love. What began as unconditional motherly love would become a fight for her own dignity and survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of Cecilia Brown's kitchen window, casting gentle patterns across the worn wooden table where she sat with her cup of Earl Grey. At 67, she had perfected the art of peaceful mornings, a ritual that had sustained her through 5 years of widowhood and 30 years in this house that Robert had lovingly called their sanctuary. Her fingers traced the rim of the china cup, a wedding gift from what felt like another lifetime. Through the window, she could see her garden awakening to another spring day. The daffodils Robert had planted were pushing through the dark soil, their bright yellow faces turned toward the sun like small prayers of hope. She made a mental note to deadhead the early tulips later. Robert had always said that proper care extended their beauty. The kitchen still held traces of Robert's presence. His favorite coffee mug sat in the cabinet, untouched but never moved. The magnetic poetry words he'd arranged on the refrigerator spelled out, "Love lives in small moments," a phrase that had made her smile every morning for the past 3 years. Even in death, he was still teaching her how to find joy in simplicity. Cecilia set down her cup and moved toward the back door, her soft slippers whispering against the hardwood floors Robert had refinished with his own hands. The morning air carried the scent of cherry blossoms from the tree they'd planted when Sarah was born 35 years ago. Everything in this house, every corner of this life, held memories like pressed flowers between the pages of her heart. She knelt carefully beside the raised herb garden, her knees protesting only slightly. The rosemary needed trimming, and the mint was already threatening to overtake the thyme. Robert used to joke that her mint was as stubborn as their son David. Impossible to contain, always pushing boundaries. The memory brought a bittersweet smile to her lips. David hadn't called in weeks, but that wasn't unusual. Their conversations had grown more sporadic over the years, usually surfacing only when he needed something. The soil was cool and damp between her fingers as she worked, grounding her in the simple pleasure of nurturing growth. This garden had been her therapy through Robert's illness, her refuge during the long nights of grief that followed his death. Here, among the familiar scents of lavender and sage, she could still feel connected to the man who had been her anchor for 42 years. The sharp ring of the telephone shattered the morning's tranquility. Cecilia paused, her hands still cupped around a cluster of young mint leaves. The phone rarely rang before 10. Telemarketers knew better, and her few regular callers respected her morning routine. She glanced at her watch, 8:23 a.m. Something cold settled in her stomach as she rose and hurried toward the kitchen. "Hello? Mom." The voice hit her like a physical blow. David's voice, but wrong. Strained. Desperate. Barely controlled. "Mom, I need you to listen to me very carefully." "David? Honey, what's wrong?" "You sound—" "I need the house." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire she couldn't yet see. Cecilia gripped the phone tighter, her other hand reaching instinctively for the kitchen counter for support. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "The house deed. I need you to sign it over to me. Today. Right now." His voice cracked on the last words, revealing something raw and frightening beneath the demand. Cecilia felt the world tilt slightly, as if the morning light had suddenly shifted and nothing looked quite the same. "David, I don't understand. What are you talking about?" I don't have time to explain everything right now. His voice rose, carrying an edge of hysteria that made her skin crawl. I just need you to trust me. Get the deed from Dad's filing cabinet and sign it over to me. I'll come get it this afternoon. David, slow down. Please, you're scaring me. Her voice carried the same gentle tone she'd used when he was 7 and had nightmares, when he was 16 and came home drunk, when he was 25 and lost his first job. Always the same voice, always trying to soothe whatever storm was raging inside her son. I'm scared too. The words exploded from him, and she could hear something breaking in his voice. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I want to ask you this? Then tell me what's happening. Let me help you. This is helping me. This is the only thing that can help me right now. His breathing was ragged, desperate. Mom, I'm in serious trouble. The kind of trouble where people get hurt if debts don't get paid. Cecilia's legs felt suddenly weak. She sank into the kitchen chair, where she'd been peacefully drinking tea just moments before. The morning that had started with daffodils and memories now felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. What kind of debts, David? It doesn't matter what kind. What matters is that I owe money to people who don't accept payment plans. And your house, our house, it's worth enough to make this whole thing go away. Our house? The words came out barely above a whisper. This house where she'd raised her children, where she'd cared for Robert through his final illness, where every room held 30 years of carefully built life. David, this is my home. And I'm your son. The words came out like a roar, all pretense of calm abandoned. I'm your son, and I'm telling you that if you don't do this, if you don't help me right now, I will never speak to you again. Do you hear me? Never. The threat hit her like cold water. In all their conflicts over the years, the school suspensions, the failed business ventures, the marriages that ended badly, David had never threatened to cut her out completely. She'd always been his safety net, the one person who never stopped believing he could turn things around. David, please don't say that. We can figure this out together. There has to be another way. There is no other way. His voice cracked completely now, and she could hear him crying. Her heart broke at the sound. Her little boy, lost and frightened, calling for his mother to save him. Mom, you don't understand. These aren't the kind of people who negotiate. They're not going to wait for me to get back on my feet or find another solution. It's your house, or I can't even tell you what happens if I don't pay them. Cecilia closed her eyes, trying to think clearly through the panic. How much money are we talking about? Enough that the house would cover it, with some left over. His voice had gone quiet now, almost childlike. Mom, I know this is huge. I know what I'm asking. But you're the only family I have left who can help me. The manipulation in those words was so subtle she almost missed it. The way he positioned himself as desperate and alone. The way he made her feel like his only lifeline. But something in her mind, Robert's voice perhaps, whispered a warning she couldn't quite grasp. What about Sarah? Have you talked to your sister? Sarah won't even take my calls anymore. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. She made it very clear years ago that she's done cleaning up my messes. But you're different, Mom. You understand that family means never giving up on each other. There it was again. That gentle pressure. The way he painted her as the good parent, the loving one, while positioning Sarah as cold and abandoning. It was a dynamic she'd seen before, but never quite recognized for what it was. David, I need to understand what's really happening here. What kind of debts? Who are these people? It doesn't matter who they are. The desperation was back in full force. What matters is that they want their money, and they want it now, and if I don't have it... His voice trailed off into something that sounded almost like a sob. Cecilia found herself leaning forward, every maternal instinct screaming at her to fix this, to save him, to do whatever it took to keep her child safe. But another voice, quieter, steadier, whispered that something wasn't right about this whole conversation. David, I need time to think about this. This house, you have 48 hours. The words came out flat, final. That's what they gave me, so that's what I'm giving you. 48 hours to decide whether you love your house more than you love your son. The line went dead. Cecilia sat in her kitchen, holding the silent phone, watching dust motes dance in the morning light that had seemed so peaceful just minutes before. The herb garden beyond the window looked the same. The daffodils still nodded in the gentle breeze, but everything had changed. The safety of her morning routine, the sanctuary of her home, the carefully rebuilt peace of her widowed life, all of it felt suddenly fragile, like a soap bubble that could burst at the slightest touch. She set the phone down with trembling hands and looked around the kitchen where she'd shared thousands of meals with Robert, where she'd bandaged scraped knees and celebrated report cards, where she'd received the call about Robert's diagnosis, and later, much later, begun to learn how to live alone. 48 hours to choose between her home and her son. The morning light no longer felt gentle. It felt harsh and demanding, illuminating all the questions she didn't have answers for, and all the fears she'd spent years trying not to name. The silence in Cecilia's kitchen felt oppressive after David's ultimatum. She sat motionless, the phone still in her lap, watching the second hand of the wall clock tick away precious moments from her 48-hour deadline. Each tick seemed to echo David's final words. 48 hours to decide whether you love your house more than you love your son. Her hands shook as she set the phone back in its cradle. The familiar kitchen suddenly felt foreign, as if David's desperate call had shifted the very foundation of her world. The morning light that had seemed so welcoming now cast harsh shadows across the table where she and Robert had shared breakfast for decades, where they'd discussed David's troubles in hushed, worried tones long into countless nights. A soft knock at the back door made her jump. Through the glass, she saw Elena Rodriguez's concerned face peering in, her silver hair catching the morning sun. Elena held a small potted plant in her weathered hands, probably another cutting from her prolific garden that she was always sharing with neighbors. "Cecilia? I saw you rush inside when the phone rang. Everything all right, Mija?" Cecilia's throat felt thick as she opened the door. Elena's warm brown eyes immediately picked up on her distress, and without invitation, her neighbor stepped inside, setting the plant on the counter and reaching for Cecilia's trembling hands. "What's happened?" The gentleness in Elena's voice broke something loose in Cecilia's chest. "It was David," she whispered, and then the words came tumbling out. The desperate call, the demand for the house, the 48-hour ultimatum. As she spoke, Elena's expression grew increasingly grave. Elena had been more than a neighbor these past 10 years. After her own messy divorce, she'd moved next door seeking peace, and she and Cecilia had formed the kind of friendship that develops between women who understand loss. But Elena brought something Cecilia had never possessed: professional experience in recognizing dysfunction. 30 years as a social worker had given her an eye for manipulation that Cecilia's maternal heart had never developed. "Sit down," Elena said firmly, guiding Cecilia to the kitchen table. "Tell me exactly what he said. Every word you can remember." As Cecilia recounted the conversation, Elena's face grew darker. When Cecilia finished, Elena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table, a habit Cecilia recognized from their many conversations about Elena's own challenging adult children. "Cecilia, how much money have you given David over the years?" The question caught her off guard. Well, that's not... he's my son. When children need help." "How much?" Elena's voice was kind but insistent. Cecilia's mind began tallying numbers she'd tried never to add up. The bail money when David was 23. The business loan that became a gift when his marketing company failed. The divorce settlements. The custody lawyer fees. The rehab program he'd quit after 2 weeks. The apartment deposits when landlords evicted him. The car payments when his credit was destroyed. Maybe 60,000? Over the years? The number sounded impossibly large when spoken aloud. Elena's eyebrows rose, but she showed no judgment, only sadness. "And how many times has he paid you back?" Cecilia felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was never about paying back. It was about helping him get back on his feet. "Is he on his feet now?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Cecilia looked around her kitchen, at Robert's coffee mug, at the magnetic poetry still spelling out messages of love, at the window that looked out on the garden where she'd felt so peaceful just an hour ago. "I don't understand why you're asking me this," Cecilia said, though part of her did understand, and that part terrified her. Elena leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Because I've watched this pattern for 10 years, Mija. Every crisis, every emergency, every time David calls in desperation, you rush to fix it. And every time, the crisis gets bigger." "He's in real danger this time, Elena. He said these people would hurt him." "Who are these people? Did he tell you?" Cecilia realized David had been deliberately vague about everything except his need for her house. "He said it was gambling debts. That they weren't the kind of people who negotiate." Elena's expression grew even more serious. "Cecilia, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. In all these years of rescuing David, has he ever gotten better? Has he ever stopped having crises?" The question hit like a physical blow. Cecilia wanted to argue, to list the times David had seemed to turn things around, but as she searched her memory, she realized that every period of stability had been temporary. Every rescue had been followed by another emergency, each one bigger than the last. "He's sick," she whispered. "The gambling, the drinking. He has problems, but he's still my child." "Of course he is," Elena said softly. "And because you love him, you keep saving him from the consequences of his choices." "But Cecilia, what if saving him is actually killing him?" The words felt like blasphemy. Everything in Cecilia's heart rebelled against the suggestion that her love could be harmful. How can helping your child ever be wrong? Elena was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the garden where Cecilia had been so peacefully working when her world turned upside down. "My youngest son, Miguel, was an addict," she said finally. "Pills, at first, then harder things. For 3 years. I paid his rent, bought his groceries, bailed him out of jail, made excuses to his employer. I told myself I was keeping him alive, keeping him from living on the streets." Cecilia had never heard this story. Elena's children were all successful adults now. She spoke of them with obvious pride during their regular coffee visits. "What happened? He overdosed in the apartment I was paying for, with drugs he bought with money I'd given him for groceries." Elena's voice was steady, but Cecilia could see the old pain in her eyes. "When I got to the hospital, the doctor told me something I'll never forget. He said, 'Mrs. Rodriguez, your love is enabling your son to die.'" The words hit Cecilia like ice water. "But Miguel is fine now. He's married, has children." "Because I stopped. I stopped paying his bills, stopped bailing him out, stopped rescuing him from his choices. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. He hated me for it. Called me a heartless mother, said I was abandoning him when he needed me most." "How long?" Cecilia's voice was barely audible. 2 years. 2 years of him bouncing between the streets and jail and temporary housing. 2 years of me lying awake wondering if I'd find out he was dead. But eventually he got desperate enough to enter real treatment. Not the kind I paid for, where he could leave whenever he wanted, but court-ordered treatment, where he had to stay and do the work. Elena reached across the table and took Cecilia's hands. "The difference was that I stopped being his safety net. When there was no one to catch him, he finally learned to catch himself." Cecilia felt tears streaming down her face. I can't risk losing him forever." "Mija, look at me." Elena's voice was firm. "You're not losing him. You're giving him the chance to find himself. But if you give him this house, if you rescue him again, what happens next time? Because there will be a next time. There always is." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The truth of those words settled into Cecilia's bones like winter cold. She thought about David's pattern, how each crisis seemed to escalate, how each rescue led to a bigger emergency. She thought about Sarah, who'd moved across the country and wouldn't even take David's calls anymore. "I need to talk to Sarah," Cecilia said suddenly. Elena nodded. "Yes. You need to hear from someone else who loves David but has learned to set boundaries. As Elena squeezed her hands, Cecilia realized that the peaceful morning she'd lost wasn't coming back. But maybe, just maybe, something more honest could take its place. The question was whether she had the courage to find out. Elena stayed with Cecilia for another hour, making tea and sitting in companionable silence, while Cecilia gathered the courage to call Sarah. When her neighbor finally left, promising to check on her later, Cecilia found herself alone again with the phone and a decision that felt impossible. She looked at the clock, 11:47 a.m. In less than 37 hours, David expected an answer that would either save or destroy him, depending on which version of the story she believed. Her fingers traced the worn phone book where Sarah's Seattle number was written in Robert's careful handwriting. He'd updated it each time she moved, always hoping the distance was temporary. The phone rang 4 times before Sarah's familiar voice answered, slightly breathless. "Mom? Is everything okay? You never call during the day." Hearing her daughter's voice unleashed a fresh wave of emotion. Sarah sounded so capable, so grounded. Everything Cecilia had once hoped David would become. The contrast between her children had always been stark. But she'd told herself it was just different personalities, different paths through life. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about your brother." The silence that followed was so complete, Cecilia wondered if the connection had been lost. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice had gone flat and careful. "What's David done now?" The resigned tone cut deep. This wasn't the voice of a sister concerned about her sibling. This was the weary response of someone who'd been through this conversation too many times. "He called this morning. He wants me to sign the house over to him. He says he's in serious trouble with some dangerous people, and if I don't help him, he'll never speak to me again." Another long silence. Then Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jesus, Mom, he's really doing this. I mean, I knew he would eventually, but I hoped." "What do you mean you knew he would?" "I mean, I've been waiting for this call for 3 years. Ever since Dad died and David realized the house was all yours now. I've been waiting for him to find a way to get his hands on it." Cecilia felt like she'd been slapped. "Sarah, that's a terrible thing to say about your brother." "Is it?" Sarah's voice grew sharper. "Mom, when was the last time David called you just to see how you were doing? When was the last time he visited without needing money or help with some crisis?" Cecilia opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She couldn't remember. Every conversation with David in recent years had been centered around his problems, his needs, his emergencies. "He's in real trouble this time, Sarah. Gambling debts. He said people might hurt him. Did he tell you how much he owes?" "Not exactly, but..." "Did he tell you who these people are?" "He said it didn't matter." "Did he show you any proof? Any documentation? Any evidence that this isn't just another story designed to get money out of you?" Each question hit like a hammer blow. Why would he lie about something like this? "Because it works." Sarah's voice cracked with frustration. "Because every single time he spins you a story about being in danger or desperate or at rock bottom, you open your wallet and fix it for him. And every time you fix it, he learns that he doesn't have to be responsible for his own choices." "Sarah, please. I know you're angry with him, but he's still your brother." "No, Mom. Stop right there." Sarah's voice went deadly quiet. "Don't you dare make this about me being angry. This isn't about anger. This is about watching my brother systematically manipulate and financially abuse our mother for years, while she makes excuses for him." The word abuse hit Cecilia like a physical blow. "That's not. David isn't abusing me. He's asking for help." "Is he?" Sarah's voice was getting louder now, years of suppressed frustration boiling over. "Mom, do you know why I moved to Seattle? Do you really know? You got the job offer at the hospital. I got 3 job offers, one in Phoenix, one in Denver, and one in Seattle. I chose Seattle because it was as far as I could get from David's chaos while still being in the continental United States." The words stung more than Cecilia wanted to admit. "You moved away because of David?" "I moved away because I couldn't watch it anymore. I couldn't watch him drain you emotionally and financially while you smiled and called it love. I couldn't watch you enable his gambling and drinking and irresponsibility and then wonder why he never got better. I was trying to help him. You were trying to control the outcome. Sarah's voice was full-blown angry now. You were trying to love him into being healthy, and all you did was teach him that actions don't have consequences as long as Mom is around to clean up the mess. Cecilia felt tears streaming down her face. I can't just abandon him. What if something really does happen to him? Something is going to happen to him anyway, Mom. The question is whether it happens now while he's still young enough to recover, or later when the stakes are even higher and the damage is even worse. But he said he'd never speak to me again. Good. The word exploded from Sarah. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe losing his safety net is the only thing that will force him to grow up. Cecilia gasped. How can you say that about your own brother? Because I love him enough to want him to get better, not just comfortable. Sarah's voice dropped to an intense whisper. Mom, I've been watching this for 15 years. Every time you rescue David, you make it easier for him to make worse choices next time. You're not helping him. You're killing him slowly. The echo of Elena's words made Cecilia's stomach clench. I don't know how to not help him. Then learn. Get therapy. Join a support group. But for God's sake, don't give him that house. Sarah? No, Mom. Listen to me very carefully. If you give David that house, I'm done. I will not watch you make yourself homeless for a son who will blow through the money and come back for more. I will not enable your enabling. You're giving me an ultimatum too? I'm setting a boundary. The same boundary I should have set years ago. I love you, Mom, but I won't be part of this dysfunction anymore. The line went quiet, except for both women's heavy breathing. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice softer but no less firm. I have to pick up Emma from soccer practice. But Mom, please think about what I've said. Really think about it. Ask yourself if all the times you've saved David have actually saved him, or if they've just postponed the inevitable while making the fall worse. The dial tone left Cecilia sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by the debris of two relationships that seemed to be crumbling simultaneously. David's ultimatum on one side, Sarah's boundary on the other, and Cecilia caught in the middle with a decision that would apparently cost her one child no matter what she chose. She looked around the kitchen that had been her sanctuary, now feeling like a war zone. The house David wanted. The house Sarah was telling her not to give up. The house where she'd raised them both. Where she'd tried so hard to love them into wholeness. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed noon. 36 hours left to decide which child she was going to lose. The weight of her discoveries pressed down on Cecilia like a physical burden. Every phone call had stripped away another layer of the story David had told her, revealing a pattern of manipulation so carefully constructed that she wondered how she'd been blind to it for so long. The afternoon light was fading, and she found herself drawn to the one place in the house where she'd always found clarity, Robert's study. The room had remained largely untouched since his death 5 years ago. His medical journals still lined the shelves, his reading glasses still sat on the mahogany desk he'd inherited from his father. The leather chair where he'd spent countless evenings reviewing patient files and working crossword puzzles still held the faint impression of his body. Cecilia had cleaned the room regularly but changed nothing, as if preserving it exactly as he'd left it might somehow preserve his presence in her life. She settled into the smaller chair across from his desk, the one where she'd brought him coffee during his late-night work sessions, where they'd discussed the children's problems and planned their retirement dreams. The room smelled of old books and the sandalwood aftershave that had been Robert's signature scent. Looking at his empty chair, she could almost see him there, his salt and pepper hair catching the lamplight, his gentle eyes focused on whatever case was troubling him. Robert had been a pediatrician, drawn to medicine by the same impulse that had made Cecilia a teacher, the desire to help children become their best selves. But unlike her, Robert had understood that sometimes helping meant setting firm boundaries. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. David at 16, arrested for joyriding in a neighbor's car. Cecilia had been frantic, ready to call lawyers, to minimize the consequences, to protect their son from the harsh realities of his choices. But Robert had sat in this very chair, calmly explaining why David needed to face the full weight of what he'd done. "He's just a child," she'd argued, the same phrase that had become her refrain through years of David's troubles. "He's old enough to make adult choices," Robert had replied. "If we don't let him experience adult consequences now, when will he learn?" They'd fought about it, one of their rare serious disagreements. In the end, Cecilia had worn him down with tears and pleas, and they'd hired a lawyer who got the charges reduced. David had learned that his actions might be serious, but his parents' love could always soften the blow. The pattern had been set that night, though Cecilia hadn't recognized it then. She rose and moved to Robert's desk, running her fingers along the familiar surfaces. In the bottom drawer, she knew, was the journal he'd kept during his final months. Not a medical record, but a personal reflection on life and family, and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. She'd read it once, shortly after the funeral, then put it away, because the raw honesty of his words had been too painful to bear. Now she pulled out the leather-bound book and opened it to a page marked with one of Robert's old prescription pads. The entry was dated just 3 months before his death, when David's second business venture was failing, and he'd come to them asking for another loan. "Cecilia wants to help David again, $25,000 this time. She sees his tears and his desperation, and her heart breaks for our son. But I see something else. I see a 40-year-old man who has never had to truly face failure because his mother's love has always been there to cushion the fall. I've tried to talk to her about this pattern, but she accuses me of being heartless, of not loving David enough. She doesn't understand that my concern comes from love too. A different kind of love, perhaps, but love nonetheless. I worry about what will happen when I'm gone. Who will provide the boundaries that David needs but resents? Who will help Cecilia see that her compassion, however well-intentioned, may be enabling the very behaviors she hopes to change? Today, David called me a bastard for questioning his business plan. Cecilia defended him, said he was just stressed, and didn't mean it. But he did mean it, and that's what frightens me. He's learned that attacking the person setting boundaries will often make those boundaries disappear. I love my son, but I'm beginning to fear that our love, or at least Cecilia's version of it, is destroying him." Tears blurred Cecilia's vision as she read her husband's words. He'd seen it so clearly, even then. The destructive cycle they'd created, the way her maternal instincts had overridden his attempts at tough love, the pattern that would only intensify after his death, removed the last voice of accountability in David's life. She flipped ahead to another marked passage, this one from just weeks before Robert's final hospitalization. Had another difficult conversation with Cecilia about David. His latest crisis is tax troubles. Apparently he hasn't filed returns in 3 years and owes the IRS a substantial amount. She wants to pay it for him. When I suggested David should face the consequences and work out a payment plan with the government, she accused me of wanting to see our son destroyed. I tried to explain that love sometimes means allowing people to struggle, to fail, to learn from their mistakes. But she can't see past her fear of losing him. She doesn't realize that by never letting him truly fail, she's preventing him from learning to succeed. I won't be here much longer. I can feel my strength failing. My greatest fear isn't death. It's leaving Cecilia vulnerable to David's manipulation without someone to help her see it for what it is. The journal trembled in Cecilia's hands. Robert had known. He'd seen exactly what would happen, and he'd tried to warn her. But grief and guilt had made her cling even more tightly to David after Robert's death, as if loving their son enough could somehow honor her husband's memory. She turned to the final entry, written in Robert's increasingly shaky handwriting. If Cecilia reads this someday, I want her to know that the hardest thing about dying isn't leaving life behind. It's leaving her to face David's problems alone. But I also want her to know that she's stronger than she believes. She has the wisdom to see truth when she's ready to see it. She has the courage to make difficult choices when she understands they're necessary. The house we built together, the life we created there, it represents everything we worked for, everything we valued. I hope she'll remember that before she sacrifices it for someone who hasn't learned to value what he's been given. Love isn't always gentle. Sometimes love requires us to step back and let the people we care about face the consequences of their choices. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to rescue someone from a problem they need to solve themselves. David will be angry if she ever sets boundaries. He'll threaten, manipulate, try to make her feel guilty for not enabling him. But that anger will be proof that the boundaries are necessary. Healthy people don't rage when asked to be responsible for their own lives. I hope she finds the strength to love him in the way he truly needs. Not the way that feels comfortable, but the way that might actually help him grow. Cecilia closed the journal and sat in the growing darkness of Robert's study. Outside, the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, marking the end of another day and bringing her closer to David's deadline. But for the first time since his phone call, she felt Robert's presence not as grief or loss, but as guidance. Her husband had seen the truth she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. David didn't need another rescue. He needed to learn that his choices had consequences, and that his mother's love, real love, honest love, might sometimes require her to say no. The question now was whether she had the courage to honor both Robert's wisdom and David's true needs, even if it meant risking the loss of her son forever. The morning of her appointment with Dr. Patricia Kim arrived gray and overcast, matching Cecilia's emotional state. She'd barely slept, haunted by Robert's journal entries and the weight of David's approaching deadline. 18 hours remained before she had to give him an answer that would reshape both their lives forever. Dr. Kim's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, its waiting room designed to feel more like a comfortable living room than a clinical space. Cecilia arrived early, her hands trembling slightly as she filled out intake forms that asked questions she'd never considered. Have you ever felt manipulated by a family member? Do you find it difficult to say no to people you love? Have you ever given money or resources to someone despite feeling uncomfortable about it? Each question felt like a small revelation, highlighting patterns she'd never named but had lived with for years. Mrs. Brown? Dr. Kim appeared in the doorway. A petite woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her voice carried a slight accent that reminded Cecilia of several Korean families she'd taught over the years. Please, come in. The office was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs arranged to encourage conversation rather than interrogation. Dr. Kim settled across from Cecilia with a gentle smile that immediately put her at ease. Elena Rodriguez spoke very highly of you when she called to make this appointment. She mentioned you're dealing with a difficult family situation involving your adult son. Cecilia found herself pouring out the entire story. David's desperate call, the house demand, the 48-hour ultimatum. Dr. Kim listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. When Cecilia finished, the room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the bookshelf. That must have been terrifying, Dr. Kim said finally. Having someone you love makes such an extreme demand, especially when they frame it as a matter of life and death. It was. It still is. Cecilia's voice was barely above a whisper. I keep thinking about what might happen to him if I say no. And what might happen to you if you say yes? The question caught Cecilia off guard. In all her worried thoughts about David's safety, she'd barely considered her own welfare. I'd lose my home. But homes can be replaced. Children can't. Dr. Kim leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Brown, in your years as a teacher, did you ever have students who would act out or refuse to do their work when they knew their parents would intervene? Of course. Some parents would do their children's homework for them, or argue with me about grades their children had earned honestly. And what happened to those children over time? Cecilia thought about former students she'd watched struggle in higher grades when their parents could no longer shield them from consequences. They had a harder time learning responsibility. They expected other people to solve their problems. Exactly. Now, I want you to think about David's pattern of crises. You mentioned this isn't the first time he's needed rescue from financial troubles. As Dr. Kim guided her through David's history, Cecilia began to see the progression clearly. Each rescue had been followed by a period of calm, then a bigger crisis. The stakes had escalated from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, and now to her entire house. This is called enabling, Dr. Kim explained gently. It's when our desire to help someone actually prevents them from developing the skills they need to help themselves. It's incredibly common among parents of addicts, and it comes from a place of deep love and fear. But how can love be wrong? Cecilia's voice cracked with confusion and pain. Love isn't wrong. But there are different ways to express love, and some of them are more helpful than others. Dr. Kim pulled a small whiteboard from beside her chair. Think about teaching again. When a student was struggling with math, did you give them all the answers to their homework? No, that wouldn't help them learn. Right. You probably gave them guidance, showed them how to work through problems, maybe provided extra practice. You helped them develop their own ability to find solutions. Dr. Kim drew 2 columns on the whiteboard. Helping builds capacity. Enabling removes the need for capacity. When we help someone, we teach them skills. When we enable someone, we teach them that they don't need skills because someone else will handle their problems. She wrote examples in each column, and Cecilia felt sick as she recognized David's life in the enabling column. Every crisis she'd solved for him had taught him that crises could be solved by calling Mom. Every consequence she'd cushioned had taught him that consequences weren't really permanent. But what if he's really in danger this time? Cecilia asked desperately. That's possible. But Mrs. Brown, I need to ask you something difficult. If you give David your house, and it solves this crisis, what do you think will happen in 6 months or a year when he faces another emergency? The answer hit Cecilia like a physical blow. He'll expect me to solve that one too, but I won't have anything left to give him. And what kind of crisis might someone face when they've learned that their problems can always be solved by someone else, but that someone else finally has nothing left? Cecilia couldn't speak. The logical progression was terrifying. David would eventually face a crisis she couldn't solve, but he'd never have learned to solve anything himself. There's another issue we need to discuss, Dr. Kim said carefully. The threats. When someone says, give me what I want or I'll never speak to you again, that's emotional blackmail. It's a form of manipulation designed to make you feel like you have no choice. But what if he means it? Then that would be his choice, not yours. Mrs. Brown, healthy people don't threaten to cut off relationships with people who won't give them material possessions. They ask for help, they accept the answer they receive, and they work to maintain the relationship regardless. Dr. Kim set down her marker and looked directly at Cecilia. I want you to imagine something. Imagine David had called and said, Mom, I'm in serious trouble with gambling debts, and I think I might be in danger. I know this is my fault, and I know you can't solve it for me, but could you help me find treatment resources and maybe let me stay with you while I get clean and figure out how to handle this legally? How would you have responded? Tears streamed down Cecilia's face as she realized she would have moved heaven and earth to help a son who approached her that way. I would have done anything to help him get better. But that's not what he asked for, is it? He asked for my house and he threatened to disappear if I didn't give it to him. Which tells us something important about where David is in his recovery process. He's not ready to get better. He's still looking for ways to avoid consequences, and he's willing to destroy your relationship to get what he wants. Dr. Kim handed Cecilia a tissue. The hardest truth about loving someone with an addiction is this: you cannot save them. Only they can save themselves. But as long as you keep rescuing them from the consequences of their choices, you remove their motivation to do the hard work of recovery. As the session ended, Dr. Kim gave Cecilia several pamphlets about families affected by addiction and the phone number for a local support group. Mrs. Brown, whatever you decide about your son's request, please remember this: choosing not to enable someone is not the same as abandoning them. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is step back and let someone face the natural consequences of their actions. Walking to her car, Cecilia felt as if she were seeing David's situation through completely different eyes. The manipulation tactics Dr. Kim had described matched David's behavior perfectly. The escalating pattern of crises, the emotional blackmail, the way he'd positioned himself as a victim of circumstances rather than someone responsible for his own choices. For the first time since David's call, Cecilia began to wonder if saying no might actually be the most loving response she could give her son. But knowing what she should do and finding the courage to do it were two very different things. Cecilia spent the morning of David's deadline in her garden, finding solace in the familiar ritual of weeding and watering. The physical work helped calm her mind as she rehearsed what she would say when he arrived. Dr. Kim's words echoed in her thoughts. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is step back and let someone face the natural consequences of their actions. At exactly 2 p.m., she heard car doors slam in her driveway. Through the front window, she watched David approach with a woman she recognized from Facebook photos as Jessica, bleached blonde hair, too tight clothes, and an expression of barely contained irritation. David looked haggard, his usually charming smile replaced by the desperate intensity she'd heard in his voice 2 days ago. Cecilia opened the door before they could knock, standing in the doorway with a calmness that surprised her. "Hello, David." "Mom." He stepped forward as if to embrace her, but something in her posture made him pause. "This is Jessica. I've told you about her." Jessica pushed past David with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Brown, David's told me so much about you." Her tone carried an undertone of judgment, as if she'd already decided Cecilia was the problem in this situation. "Please, come in." Cecilia led them to the living room, noting how David's eyes immediately began cataloging the space, the antique furniture, the family photos, the valuable pieces he'd grown up with. She'd seen that calculating look before, but had always dismissed it as nostalgia. David settled on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. "Mom, I can't tell you how much this means to me. I knew you'd understand that family comes first." He pulled out a manila folder from his jacket. "I brought all the paperwork. We can get this notarized today and—" "David, stop." Cecilia's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not signing over the house." The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, then something darker. Jessica's mask of false friendliness dropped completely. "What do you mean you're not signing it over?" David's voice climbed higher. "Mom, I explained the situation. These people aren't joking around. They want their money, and they want it now." "Then perhaps you should give them their money," Cecilia replied calmly. David shot to his feet, beginning to pace. "I don't have their money. That's what I've been trying to tell you. The house is the only way to get enough to pay them off and have something left over to start fresh." "Start fresh?" Cecilia repeated. "David, how many times have we talked about starting fresh? How many times have I helped you start fresh?" Jessica leaned forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Mrs. Brown, I don't think you understand how serious this is. David could be seriously hurt if he doesn't pay these people back." "By these people, you mean Marcus," Cecilia said quietly. David froze mid-pace. "How do you know that name?" "I made some phone calls. I wanted to understand what was really happening." Cecilia's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "I spoke with Jennifer. With Tom from your old business. With several of your former friends." David's face flushed red. "You had no right to go behind my back." "Behind your back?" Cecilia stood up, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "David, you called me demanding I sign over my house in 48 hours, but I had no right to verify your story?" "It wasn't a story!" David's voice cracked with desperation. "Mom, everything I told you was true." "Was it? Then why did Tom tell me you've been researching my property value for months? Why did your ex-girlfriend say you referred to my house as a trust fund you could access whenever you needed it?" Jessica jumped up, pointing an accusatory finger at Cecilia. "You're a selfish old woman. Your son is in danger, and you're worried about some house?" "This house is my home," Cecilia replied firmly. "It's where I raised my children, where I cared for my dying husband, where I've built a life. And yes, I'm concerned about losing it to enable my son's gambling addiction." "I'm not addicted," David shouted. "I just had some bad luck, made some poor choices." "For 20 years?" Cecilia's voice cut through his protests. "David, I've been tracking the money I've given you. In 2 decades, I've provided over $60,000 for your various crises. How much of that was gambling related?" David's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Jessica stepped closer to him, her voice turning vicious. "Don't let her guilt trip you, baby. She's your mother. She's supposed to help you." Help him what? Cecilia turned to face Jessica fully. Help him avoid consequences? Help him continue gambling? Help him never learn to solve his own problems? Help him survive, Jessica shrieked. What kind of mother chooses a house over her child's life? The kind who loves her child enough to stop enabling his self-destruction. The words came out with a strength Cecilia didn't know she possessed. David collapsed back onto the couch, his head in his hands. Mom, please, I'm begging you. Just this once. Just this last time, and I swear I'll get help. I'll go to counseling. I'll join GA, whatever you want. You've promised those things before, David. After the business loan. After the divorce settlements. After the bail money. Every crisis comes with promises you don't keep. This is different. How? How is it different? David looked up at her with tears streaming down his face. And for a moment, she saw the little boy who used to run to her with scraped knees and broken dreams. Because I'm really scared this time, Mom. I'm scared of what they'll do to me. Cecilia's heart broke at the genuine fear in his voice, but Dr. Kim's words held her steady. I'm scared too, David. I'm scared that if I rescue you again, you'll never learn to rescue yourself. I'm scared that the next crisis will be even worse, because you'll have learned that no consequence is ever permanent as long as Mom is around to fix it. David's expression shifted from tears to rage so quickly it made Cecilia step backward. So that's it? You're just going to let them hurt me? I'm going to let you handle your own problems like the 42-year-old man you are. Fine. David jumped up, grabbing Jessica's hand. Fine. You want to be a selfish bitch? You want to choose your precious house over your own son? Then you've made your choice. Jessica added her own venom. Don't come crying to us when you're old and alone and need someone to take care of you. David won't be there. David turned at the door, his face twisted with anger and hurt. I meant what I said, Mom. If you don't help me now, you'll never see me again. This is your last chance. Cecilia felt her knees shaking, but her voice remained steady. Then that will be your choice, David, not mine. The door slammed so hard the windows rattled. Cecilia stood in her living room, surrounded by the silence David and Jessica had left behind. The manila folder with the house transfer papers lay forgotten on her coffee table, testament to how certain David had been that his manipulation would work. For the first time in 48 hours, Cecilia felt something unexpected. Relief. The waiting was over. The choice was made. Whatever consequences followed, she had finally chosen truth over comfort, love over enabling. But as she watched David's car disappear down the street, she also felt the crushing weight of what that choice might cost her. She might never see her son again. She might never know if he found safety, if he got help, if he ever learned to build a life he could be proud of. The only thing she knew for certain was that she had finally loved him the way Robert had tried to teach her. Not the way that felt good, but the way that might actually help him grow. Whether David would ever understand that remained to be seen. The silence in Cecilia's house felt different after David left. Not the peaceful quiet she'd cherished in her morning routines, but a hollow emptiness that seemed to echo with the finality of slammed doors and severed connections. She stood in her living room for several minutes after his car disappeared, staring at the manila folder he'd left behind, like evidence of a crime that had been prevented rather than committed. Her hands shook as she picked up the legal documents, house transfer papers already filled out in David's careful handwriting, with only her signature missing. The efficiency of it disturbed her almost as much as the demand itself. This hadn't been a desperate last-minute plan. He'd prepared for this conversation, confident in his ability to manipulate her into compliance. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. For a wild moment, she hoped it might be David calling to apologize, to say he understood her position, to ask for real help instead of financial rescue. Instead, Elena's warm voice filled the receiver. Mija, I saw David's car leave. How did it go? The simple question broke something loose in Cecilia's chest. I said no, she whispered, then louder. Elena, I actually said no. Oh, honey, how do you feel? Cecilia sank into Robert's old reading chair, the leather still holding the faint impression of his body. Terrible, relieved, guilty, proud. I don't know how I feel. She paused, trying to sort through the chaos of emotions. He was so angry, Elena. I've never seen him like that. And his girlfriend. She called me a selfish old woman. And what did you say to that? I told her this house was my home, not a resource to be exploited. The memory of her own strength in that moment surprised her. I didn't know I had it in me to stand up to them like that. Elena's voice carried pride and warmth. You've always had that strength, Cecilia. You just needed to remember it was there. They talked for another 20 minutes, Elena providing the steady presence Cecilia needed to process what had just happened. After hanging up, Cecilia found herself drawn to the kitchen window that looked out on her garden. The herbs she'd been tending when David first called seemed like symbols of a different life, a before and after marked by a single phone conversation. The second call came 3 hours later, just as the sun was setting. This time it was Sarah, her voice tight with concern. Mom, David just called me. He's furious. He said you refused to help him and that he's never speaking to either of us again. Cecilia braced herself for another confrontation, another family member angry at her choice. Instead, Sarah's next words surprised her. I'm proud of you. You are? Mom, I know how hard that must have been. David can be incredibly persuasive when he wants something, and saying no to him. I know it goes against every maternal instinct you have. Tears welled in Cecilia's eyes. I keep wondering if I've made a terrible mistake. What if he really is in danger? What if something happens to him and it's my fault for not helping? Mom, listen to me. Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone who'd wrestled with these same questions. David's problems are not your fault. His solutions are not your responsibility. And his threats, emotional, physical, or otherwise, are not your burden to carry. But he's my son. He's also a 42-year-old man who needs to learn that actions have consequences. You've protected him from those consequences his entire adult life. Maybe it's time to let him figure out how to protect himself. As they talked, Sarah revealed details about her own journey toward setting boundaries with David. The guilt she'd carried when she moved across the country. The therapy she'd needed to process the family dynamics. The gradual realization that enabling David hadn't helped him. It had prevented him from growing up. Has he ever threatened to cut you off? Cecilia asked, multiple times. When I wouldn't co-sign a loan. When I wouldn't let him stay with us after his second divorce. When I told him he couldn't borrow money from the kids' college funds. Sarah's voice grew stronger with each example. Each time, I thought I was losing my brother forever. But you know what I learned? David doesn't actually want to lose his family. He just wants us to believe he's willing to, because that threat has always worked before. What if this time is different? Then that's his choice to make. But Mom, even if he follows through on his threat, you still made the right decision. Giving him the house wouldn't have saved him. It would have just delayed the inevitable while making the next crisis even bigger. After Sarah hung up, promising to call again tomorrow, Cecilia felt something she hadn't expected, a tentative sense of peace. For the first time in years, both her children were speaking to her from positions of honesty rather than manipulation or guilt. The evening news provided an unexpected validation of her decision. A story about predatory lending and illegal gambling operations mentioned several names that sounded familiar from her investigation into David's situation. The reporter described a pattern of targeting desperate gamblers, inflating debts through impossible interest rates, then pressuring them to involve family members as guarantors or collateral sources. Cecilia realized that David hadn't just been manipulating her, he'd likely been manipulated himself, caught in a web designed to exploit both addicts and their families. The recognition didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped her understand that her refusal might have saved them both from an even more devastating outcome. That night, she slept better than she had in months. The house felt secure around her, not because she'd chosen it over David, but because she'd finally chosen honesty over enabling, difficult love over comfortable lies. When she woke the next morning, she found herself returning to her garden routine with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The herbs needed tending, the weeds needed pulling, and she had work to do, not just in her garden, but in learning how to love her son in a way that might actually help him heal. The hard part was over. The healing, for both of them, could finally begin. 3 months had passed since David's ultimatum, and Cecilia was surprised to discover that life without the constant undercurrent of crisis felt both lighter and more meaningful. The absence of David's dramatic phone calls had created space for other relationships to flourish, connections she'd neglected while managing his endless emergencies. The morning sun streamed through her kitchen window as she prepared for what had become a cherished weekly ritual, coffee with Elena before their volunteer shift at the community center. Elena had introduced her to a support group for families affected by addiction, and Cecilia had gradually found the courage to share her story with others who understood the complex dance of love and enabling. "You look different," Elena observed as they walked toward the community center together. "More settled." Cecilia considered the word. Settled. Yes, that captured something essential about how she felt. Not the restless anxiety of waiting for the next crisis call, but a grounded sense of her own worth and boundaries. "I feel like I'm remembering who I was before I became consumed with fixing David's problems," she replied. "For so many years, especially after Robert died, I defined myself by how well I could rescue him. Now I'm learning to define myself by my own choices and values." Their volunteer work involved helping families navigate social services, a natural fit for Elena's background, and a meaningful way for Cecilia to use her teaching skills in a new context. Today they were working with Maria, a young mother whose husband's addiction had left her struggling to provide for their 3 children. "I keep thinking I should do more," Maria confided during their session. "Maybe if I try harder, love him better, he'll want to get clean for us." Cecilia felt the familiar ache of recognition. 6 months ago, she would have encouraged Maria's impulse to try harder, to love more. Now she understood the dangerous trap in that thinking. "Maria," she said gently, "you can't love someone into recovery. They have to want it for themselves. But he's a good man underneath the addiction. If I give up on him, who will believe in him?" Elena and Cecilia exchanged a knowing look. Believing in someone and enabling their addiction are 2 different things. Elena said, "You can believe David is capable of recovery while still protecting yourself and your children from the chaos of his choices." As they worked with Maria throughout the morning, Cecilia felt the deep satisfaction of using her experience, painful as it had been, to help someone else avoid the same mistakes. The group facilitator had suggested she consider training to become a peer counselor, an idea that appealed to her more each week. The afternoon brought an unexpected joy. Sarah's voice on the phone, animated with excitement. "Mom, I have news. Tom got a promotion, and we've decided to use his signing bonus for something special. We want to bring the kids to visit you for 2 weeks this summer." Cecilia felt tears of happiness welling in her eyes. Sarah's children, Emma and Jake, were now 15 and 13. Teenagers she barely knew because David's crises had consumed so much of her emotional energy during their childhood. The few visits over the years had been brief and strained, shadowed by family drama. "Sarah, that would be wonderful. But are you sure? I know traveling with teenagers isn't easy, and the expense." "Mom, stop." Sarah's voice carried gentle laughter. "We want to do this. The kids barely know their grandmother, and that's partly my fault for keeping my distance while you were dealing with David's problems. I want them to know the woman who raised me, not the crisis manager you became." As they planned the visit, Cecilia felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. She began imagining summer activities, teaching Emma to bake Robert's famous chocolate chip cookies, taking Jake to the local historical society where she'd started volunteering, sharing stories about their family history that didn't revolve around David's troubles. "How are you doing with the David situation?" Sarah asked, her tone growing more serious. "Some days are harder than others," Cecilia admitted. "I worry about him. I wonder if he's safe, if he's getting help. But I don't regret my decision." "Have you heard anything about what happened after that day?" "A little. Elena has a friend who works in the court system. Apparently, David did have to face some legal consequences, but not the violent threats he claimed. He entered a court-mandated treatment program instead of jail time." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "So he's getting help?" "It appears so. Whether he's engaging with it genuinely, or just going through the motions to satisfy the court, I don't know. But at least he's in a structured environment where professionals can assess his needs." The conversation reminded Cecilia of something Drive. Kim had told her during one of their ongoing sessions. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is step back and let professionals handle situations we're not equipped to manage. That evening, Cecilia found herself in Robert's study again, but this time to work rather than mourn. She'd been writing in a journal Dr. Kim had suggested, not dwelling on the past, but processing her feelings and tracking her growth. Tonight she wanted to capture her thoughts about Sarah's visit and the changes in their relationship. Sarah sounds like herself again when we talk now, not the careful, guarded daughter who was always bracing for the next David crisis. I realized I had been asking her to carry emotional burdens that weren't hers to bear. When I was consumed with David's problems, I made Sarah feel responsible for my happiness and stability. No wonder she moved across the country. But now we can talk about her work, her children, her dreams for the future. She's sharing more about her marriage, her challenges as a parent, the normal struggles and joys that I missed when all my attention was focused on David's emergencies. I'm beginning to understand that I had 2 children, but I only allowed one of them to be fully present in my life. David's chaos took up so much space that Sarah learned to make herself smaller, less needy, easier to manage. I failed her by accepting that dynamic instead of maintaining boundaries that would have protected our relationship. The phone rang, interrupting her writing. For a split second, her heart jumped with the old fear, David calling with another crisis. But the caller ID showed Dr. Kim's office number. Mrs. Brown, I hope you don't mind me calling in the evening. I wanted to let you know about an opportunity that might interest you. Dr. Kim explained that the county was looking for volunteers to help with a new program, support groups specifically for parents and family members of adult children with addiction issues. They needed people with lived experience who had successfully learned to set boundaries. I immediately thought of you, Dr. Kim continued. Your journey from enabling to healthy love could provide hope and guidance to other parents facing similar struggles. As Cecilia considered the opportunity, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: excitement about her own future, rather than anxiety about someone else's problems. The idea of using her teaching skills and her personal experience to help other families navigate these treacherous waters felt like a calling. I'd like to think about it, she said. Can I let you know next week? Of course. But Cecilia, I want you to know how proud I am of the progress you've made. You've transformed from someone defined by other people's crises into someone who can help others find their own strength. After hanging up, Cecilia returned to her journal with renewed energy. The summer visit from Sarah and the children, the possibility of becoming a peer counselor, the weekly volunteer work that fed her soul. Her life was filling up with purposeful activities and genuine relationships. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt like she was building a future rather than merely surviving the present. David's absence from her life still caused her pain, but it had also created space for healing, growth, and connections she'd forgotten were possible. The question of whether David would ever be ready for a different kind of relationship remained unanswered. But Cecilia was finally learning to live with that uncertainty, while building a life that didn't depend on his choices for her happiness. She was, at last, learning to love him from a distance, the kind of love that hoped for his healing without sacrificing her own well-being, the kind of love that Robert had tried to teach her years ago. 1 year had passed since David's ultimatum, and Cecilia stood at the podium of the community center conference room, looking out at 23 faces, parents, spouses, siblings, and adult children, all united by the shared experience of loving someone with an addiction. The support group she'd helped establish had grown, from 5 nervous participants to this thriving community of people learning to navigate the complex terrain of healthy boundaries and difficult love. When my son called me screaming that I had to give him my house or lose him forever, Cecilia began, her voice steady and clear. I thought I was facing a choice between loving him and abandoning him. What I learned was that I was actually choosing between enabling his addiction and truly loving him for the first time in years. She'd given this talk dozens of times now, but it never got easier to share the details of David's manipulation and her journey toward clarity. Today felt different, though, charged with an anticipation she couldn't quite name. After the meeting, as participants lingered over coffee and shared their own stories, Cecilia's phone buzzed with a text message. The number wasn't familiar, but her heart recognized the cadence of the words immediately. "Mom, this is David. I got your number from the treatment center. I know I don't have the right to ask, but would you be willing to meet with me?" "I understand if the answer is no." Cecilia stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. Elena, who had been helping stack chairs, noticed her expression and moved closer. "What is it, Mija?" "David wants to meet." Cecilia's voice was barely above a whisper. Elena took the phone and read the message, her eyebrows rising. "How do you feel about that?" It was the question Dr. Kim had taught her to ask herself first, in any situation involving David. How did she feel, separate from what she thought she should feel or what others expected her to feel? "Scared," Cecilia admitted. "Hopeful. Cautious." She paused, searching for the right words. "Different than I would have felt a year ago." 3 days later, Cecilia sat in a neutral location, a quiet cafe downtown that neither of them had history with. She'd chosen a public place on Dr. Kim's advice, somewhere she could leave easily if the conversation became manipulative or emotionally abusive. David arrived exactly on time, and Cecilia was struck by how much he'd changed. Gone was the desperate energy she remembered from their last encounter. He looked older, quieter, with something in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. Genuine humility. "Thank you for coming," he said as he sat down across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Cecilia replied honestly, "but I realized I needed to hear what you had to say." David nodded, seeming to gather himself before speaking. "Mom, I need to start by saying something I should have said years ago. I'm sorry. Not just for the house thing, but for everything. For lying to you, manipulating you, using your love for me as a weapon to get what I wanted." The apology caught Cecilia off guard with its specificity. In the past, David's apologies had been vague and self-serving. "I'm sorry you're upset," or "I'm sorry things got so complicated." This felt different. "The treatment program made me write down every time I could remember lying to you or asking you for money," David continued. "The list was 17 pages long, Mom. 17 pages of times I chose my addiction over my relationship with you." Cecilia felt tears welling in her eyes, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "When you said no about the house, I was furious. I told everyone in treatment that you were a heartless mother who cared more about property than her own son. My counselor asked me to think about why someone who had given me $60,000 over 20 years would suddenly become heartless." David's voice cracked slightly. "It took me months to understand that you weren't being heartless. You were finally being healthy. What happened with Marcus? With the debts?" David's face darkened. "Some of it was real. I did owe money to people who weren't patient about repayment. But the amount I told you, the immediate danger, I exaggerated to make you feel like you had no choice but to help me." He looked down at his hands. "The court-ordered treatment probably saved my life, but not in the way I claimed it would." They talked for 2 hours, and Cecilia found herself listening to a version of David she'd rarely encountered, one who took responsibility for his choices without blaming external circumstances or other people. He told her about the group therapy sessions, where he'd finally understood how his manipulation had damaged not just her, but Sarah, his ex-wives, his children. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness," David said as their conversation drew to a close. "And I know trust has to be earned back slowly, if at all. But I want you to know that refusing to give me the house was the most loving thing you could have done. It forced me to face consequences I'd been running from for decades." Cecilia studied her son's face, looking for signs of the manipulation she'd learned to recognize. Instead, she saw something she'd almost given up hoping for: genuine remorse and the beginning of real accountability. "Where do we go from here?" she asked. "I don't know," David admitted. "I'm still in the early stages of recovery. I have a lot of work to do on myself before I can be the son you deserved all along. But if you're willing, I'd like to try building a different kind of relationship with you, one based on honesty instead of crisis." As Cecilia drove home that afternoon, she reflected on the full circle her life had taken. A year ago, she'd been a woman defined by other people's emergencies. Someone who mistook enabling for love and feared that setting boundaries meant losing relationships. Now she was someone who understood that the hardest choices could lead to the most healing outcomes. David's recovery was still fragile, and she knew better than to assume this conversation meant all their problems were solved. But for the first time in years, she felt hope. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to control an outcome, but the peaceful hope of someone who had learned to love without enabling, to care without controlling, to believe in someone's potential while accepting their current reality. That evening, she called Sarah to share the news of David's contact. Sarah listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and expressing cautious optimism. "How do you feel about it, Mom?" Sarah asked, the same question Elena had posed. "Grateful," Cecilia replied. "Grateful that I learned to say no when he needed to hear it most. Grateful that he's still alive and getting help. And grateful that I finally understand the difference between loving someone and rescuing them." As she hung up the phone and looked around her peaceful kitchen, the same kitchen where David's desperate call had shattered her world a year ago, Cecilia felt a deep sense of completion. She'd learned that sometimes the most profound act of love is refusing to enable someone's self-destruction, even when they threaten to punish you for it. The house she'd fought to keep had become more than her sanctuary. It had become the symbol of her own worth, her right to make difficult choices, and her capacity to love from a place of strength rather than fear. Whatever the future held for her relationship with David, she would meet it as a whole person rather than someone defined by his chaos. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift she could offer both of them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.